The alarm was screaming again. Dr. Vensa had heard that alarm 200 times in her life. She was old enough to know that the sound never got easier. It just got familiar. She moved fast through the wide corridor of the medical ship, her fourth in. Fingers already pulling on her gloves, her dark eyes scanning the incoming patient list on the wall screen. 3. Thalori, 2 Mindari, 1 human. She stopped for just half a second when she saw that last word human, then she kept moving. The ship was called Orcs. It was a coalition medical vessel, and it floated in the dark space above a broken asteroid belt where a battle had ended only 40 minutes ago. The battle itself was not her problem. The wounded were the doors opened and the stretchers came in fast. The first 2 patients were Valori soldiers with burn wounds across their shoulders. Vensa pointed them to the left bay without even thinking. Her hands already knew what to do. Her mind was already calculating coagulant doses and skin repair times. Then the 3rd stretcher came through the door, and Vensa stopped breathing for a moment, not because of what she saw, because of what she smelled. The human on the stretcher was a woman. Her name was written on a tag clipped to her torn uniform, Sergeant Dara Okonkwo. She was tall, even lying down. Her dark skin was cut in 4 places across her side and stomach. The wounds were deep shrapnel from the look of it. Her eyes were half open, and she was trying to say something, but her voice was too low to hear. None of that was what stopped Vensa. Was the smell. Vensa belonged to a species called the Tharkai. Their noses were not just better than most species in the coalition. They were extraordinary. Tharkai could smell a fire 3 corridors away. They could smell fear on a patient before the patient knew they were afraid. They could smell the difference between 2 types of infection just by standing near a wound, and what Vensa smelled coming from this human woman was something she had never smelled from a living body before. It was metal, not a light smell, not a background smell. It was strong and sharp and deep, like the inside of an engine room, like hot steel, like the ore they used to build the outer panels of warships. It smelled the way a forge smelled when the fire was heist. Vensa had treated humans before. She had patched cuts and set bones and treated infections, but she had never leaned this close. She had never had a human bleeding this much. Right in front of her nose, she stood there for exactly 3 seconds, doing nothing. Then, her training took over. She moved to the stretcher fast. She called out orders to the young Mindari nurse beside her. She asked for the wound kit and the scanner and the pressure wrap. Her hands moved on their own, pressing down on the deepest cut to slow the bleeding. Her mind was doing all the right things, but underneath all of that, one question was sitting very still and very loud. Why does this woman smell like iron? The next 30 minutes were hard work. The wounds were serious, but not impossible. Vensa had seen worse. She cleaned each cut carefully. She removed 3 small pieces of shrapnel from the lower side. She closed the deepest wound with a medical seal that would hold better than stitches. She gave the patient something for pain and something to help her blood pressure stay steady. Through all of it, Sergeant Dara Okonkwo said nothing. She drifted in and out. She opened her eyes twice, and both times she looked directly at Vensa with a calm that felt strange for someone in that much pain. Most patients grabbed the bed rail or cried out or asked where they were. This woman just looked like she had been here before, like pain was a place she had visited so many times it no longer surprised her when the worst of the work was done and Dara was stable and the machines beside her were showing steady lines. Vensa stood back and took a slow breath. The smell was still there, softer, now that the wounds were sealed, but still present. Still that iron edge cutting through the clean air of the medical bay. Vensa looked at her own gloves. They were dark with the patient's blood. She looked at that blood for a long moment. It was red, just like the blood of several other species in the coalition. But the smell was completely different. The Lori blood smelled like salt water, like the ocean. Mindari blood had a faint sweetness, almost like something growing in the ground. Tharkai blood. Her own blood smelled like warm copper and something earthy, but this smelled like the hull of a ship. She pulled off the gloves slowly, and walked to the side of the bed. Dara's eyes were open again, watching the ceiling. Her breathing was slow, and even she was not asleep. She was just quiet. Vanessa stood there for a moment, not sure if she should speak. She was a doctor. She had asked many questions of many patients in her long career. She had asked about pain levels and medical history and family conditions and things far more personal than this. But this question felt different. This question felt like it might have an answer that was too big for a hospital room. She asked it anyway. She kept her voice soft, the way she always did with patients who had just come through pain. She said, "Forgive me, Sergeant, I have treated many species in this bay. I have treated 34 kinds of living bodies. I have smelled blood more times than I can count. But yours, I have never smelled anything like yours. Can you tell me why your blood smells like metal?" She expected confusion. She expected the patient to frown or ask what she meant, or say she did not understand the question. Dara did not do any of those things. She turned her head slowly on the pillow and she looked at Vanessa, the way someone looks when they are very tired, but also faintly amused. Like a person who has been asked a question they have heard before, just never in quite those words. And then she said something. Her voice was low and rough from the pain and the medicine, but the words were clear. She said, "Because it is," and then her eyes closed and she was asleep. Vanessa stood beside the bed for a long time after that. The machines beeped softly. The ship moved slowly through the dark. The other patients in the bay breathed and shifted and sometimes called out quietly, but Vanessa did not move. She stood there and looked at the sleeping soldier and thought about those 3 words, because it is such a simple answer, said like it was nothing, said like it was the most obvious thing in the world, and somehow that made it feel like the most dangerous answer Vanessa had ever received in her 60 years of medicine, because simple answers to impossible questions were never actually simple. They were just the surface, and whatever was underneath had not yet shown itself. Vanessa did not sleep that night. She told herself she would. She finished her rounds. She checked on the other patients. She wrote her initial reports on the Valori soldiers and signed off on the Mindari case files. She drank the warm, bitter drink her people used at the end of a hard shift, and she sat in her small office, and she told herself she would close her eyes for a few hours. But the 3 words were still sitting in her head, because it is she opened the Coalition database at the 2nd hour of the night cycle. Every species in the Coalition had a file in that database. Every species that had joined the Alliance had submitted their biology, their history, their medical needs, their known weaknesses, their dietary requirements, and thousands of other small details, so that doctors like Vanessa could treat them in emergencies without guessing. She had looked at the human file before years ago. When humans first joined the Coalition, she had spent one afternoon reading through it. She had noted the important things: average body temperature, healing rate, common allergies, dietary habits. She had learned enough to treat a human in a basic emergency, and then she had moved on. She had never read the whole file. She opened it. Now she went past the basic sections. She scrolled through the pages about temperature and diet and sleep. She moved past the sections on human communication and human social behavior. She went looking for the part about blood. She found it buried in a section called Internal Biology and Circulatory Systems. She started reading, and within 10 minutes, she had to stand up and walk to the small window of her office and stand there with her hands pressed flat on the glass and breathe. She went back to the desk and read it again more slowly. The human body used iron to carry oxygen through the blood, not a biological mineral analog, not a processed compound, not something developed in a lab or adapted from a synthetic source. Iron, elemental iron, the same iron that existed in the ground, the same iron that was pulled from asteroids and refined in factories and used to build the walls of ships and the frames of weapons and the bones of space stations. The humans had iron in their blood. The molecule responsible was called hemoglobin. a protein that wrapped itself around iron atoms and used those iron atoms to grab oxygen from the lungs and carry it to every part of the body. Every beat of the human heart sent iron-carrying molecules racing through veins and arteries, delivering life to muscle and brain and organ. Vensa read the word hemoglobin several times. She had seen it in passing. She had never once stopped to think about what it actually meant. She called up the evolutionary section of the file. This was the part that broke something open in her mind. Billions of years ago, the database explained the early oceans of the human homeworld Earth were full of dissolved iron. The very first living things on that planet, the oldest, simplest, earliest forms of life, had used that iron. Those organisms had iron running through the most basic parts of their biology then. Something happened called the Great Oxidation Event. Oxygen flooded the atmosphere of Earth in enormous amounts. Most iron-dependent life died. The iron in the oceans became locked away, became rust, became stone. The environment changed completely and violently and fast. Almost everything that depended on iron was destroyed. Almost everything. Small group of organisms did not die. Instead, they changed. They did not let go of the iron. They pulled it inside themselves. They locked it into proteins. They kept it sheltered and controlled inside their own cells, and they used it to do something no other life on the planet was doing at the time. They used it to power themselves more completely than anything else alive. Everything on Earth that had a spine, everything that breathed, everything that ran or swam or flew, or eventually looked up at the sky and thought about the stars, was a descendant of those organisms. Iron was not something humans had picked up along the way. Iron was what they were built from. It was in them before complex life existed, before land. Animals existed before the first creature pulled itself out of the ocean and breathed air. Iron had been in the line that led to humans since the very beginning, since the oldest chapter of life on their world. Vensa sat very still for a long time. Then she called Dr. Elshelsh. Was a Valori, a species that was calm by nature and hard to surprise. He had worked in medicine for 40 years. He was the closest thing Vensa had to a person she could call at the second hour of the night. Cycle without feeling embarrassed about I answered, looking tired and slightly confused. She told him to open the human biology file. She told him to go to the circulatory section. She waited while he read. She watched his face on the screen. She saw the exact moment he understood. His eyes moved faster across the screen. His mouth opened slightly. Then he stopped scrolling and just stared at one page for a long time. Then he looked up at her. He said, "They use iron," she said. "Yes." He said, "Actual iron." She said, "Actual iron." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How long?" She said, "Since before complex life existed on most of our home worlds." Another silence. He said, "And they just did not tell anyone." She thought about that. She said, "I think they assumed we knew." She thought about the way Dara had answered her question in the medical bay. The tired amusement. The tone of someone explaining something they thought was common knowledge. "I think they all assume we know," she said again, "and none of us ever looked closely enough to realize we did know." Telsh rubbed his face with one long pale hand. He said, "Do you understand what this means for medical treatment?" And that was when the second part of the shock arrived. Because Vensa had been so focused on the biology of it, on the history and the chemistry, that she had not yet turned that knowledge toward what it meant for her work. She pulled up the section on iron regulation in the human body. The human body did not just carry iron. It managed it constantly, like a careful system designed over millions of years to never waste a single atom. When blood cells died, the iron inside them was recovered and reused. When iron levels dropped, the body pulled it from storage in the liver. When a human ate food, the digestive system pulled iron out of that food with a precision that no other species in the coalition matched. And when a human bled, the clotting system was fast, faster than almost anything in the coalition database. Platelets, chemicals in the blood, a whole chain of reactions that sealed wounds quickly. The body treated blood loss like a threat to be solved immediately, aggressively, intelligently. Vance thought about Dara lying on the stretcher tonight for wounds, any one of them serious enough to require immediate treatment in a Tharkai or Valori patient. Dara had still been conscious when she arrived. She had still been trying to speak. Vensa closed the database and sat in her dark office outside. Through the small window, stars were very still. She thought about all the battles in the coalition records, where human soldiers had been listed as walking wounded, where the report said minor injury and continued mission, and she had never questioned those notes. She was questioning them now. She was wondering how many of those minor injuries would have been major injuries in any other species. She was wondering what else was in that file that she had never read carefully enough. She was wondering how many other doctors across the fleet had done exactly what she had done. Opened the file, read the basic sections, closed it, and never gone deep enough to find out what they were actually dealing with. She looked at the clock. It was very late. She was not going to sleep. She pulled the database back open and started reading from the beginning of the human file, this time all of it, every word. By morning, the word had spread through the medical bay, not because Vensa had announced anything, not because she had written a report or called a meeting. She had simply been reading at her desk when the young Mindari nurse Orcs came in to ask about the morning patient list, and she had shown him what she found on the screen because she needed someone else to see it and confirm that she was reading it correctly. Orcs read it. Then Orcs told the two other nurses, and then somehow within 2 hours 6 members of the medical staff were standing in the small common room of the ship, reading different sections of the human biology file on different screens and saying almost nothing. It was Orcs who found the note that stopped everyone completely. He was not even looking for it. He had been reading through a section about human history and culture that was attached to the medical file as background material. It was the kind of section that most doctors skipped because it was not directly about treatment. It was just context. But Orcs read everything. He was young and new, and he still thought every piece of information might matter someday. And in that section, buried between notes about human agriculture and human building methods, he found a paragraph about ancient human warriors. The paragraph was short. It said that in many early human cultures, soldiers who had survived many battles carried a particular smell with them, a metallic smell, a smell of iron. It stayed on their skin and in their clothing even after they had cleaned themselves. People who lived near these warriors noticed it. People wrote about it in their oldest surviving texts. The smell was so distinct and so consistently noted across different human cultures that it became symbolics. Some cultures believed the smell meant the warrior had been touched by divine forces. Some believed it meant death could not find them. Some believed it was the mark of someone the world itself had chosen to keep alive. The humans had smelled it on themselves for thousands of years. They had built entire mythologies around it, and they had never known it was iron. They had never known it was their own blood drying on their skin after wounds had closed faster than any medic could explain. They had never known that the gods they prayed to for survival were really just the biology inside them doing what it had been doing for 500 million years. Orcs read the paragraph out loud to the room. When he finished, no one spoke for a very long time. Dr. Alsh, who had come to the ship early that morning after his call with Vensa, was standing by the far wall with his arms crossed. He was looking at the floor the way he looked when he was thinking very hard about something and did not want to be interrupted. Finally, he said something. He said, "Think about every human soldier you have ever treated in this bay. Think about the ones who came in bleeding and were walking and talking by the next day. Think about the ones who should have been in recovery for a week and were asking to return to duty after 3 days. Think about the ones who looked at their own wounds, not with fear, but with something closer to mild frustration." The room was quiet. Everyone was thinking. Vensa said, "I have always assumed that was psychological. I thought humans had a higher pain tolerance, perhaps a cultural attitude toward injury. I thought they were simply trained to push through discomfort. Elsh looked at her. He said, "What if it is not just psychological? What if their body is actually closing those wounds faster than ours? What if their blood is doing something that ours simply cannot do at the same speed?" Venza had already thought this, but hearing someone else say it out loud made it feel more real. She walked to the screen and pulled up two comparison charts side by side. One showed the clotting speed of Tharkai blood under battlefield conditions. The second showed the equivalent data for humans pulled from coalition medical records of actual field injuries. The difference was significant. Human blood began its sealing process almost immediately after exposure to air. The chain of chemical reactions happened fast and layered on top of each other efficiently. Each stage triggered the next with very little delay. The end result was a temporary seal, forming over moderate wounds in a fraction of the time it would take in most coalition species. The iron was part of this. The hemoglobin carried oxygen to the wound site, quickly keeping surrounding tissue alive while the repair began. The iron-based chemistry interacted with the clotting proteins in ways that the database described as highly efficient, but the Venza now read as something closer to extraordinary. One of the nurses, a Valori woman named Sheva, said something quietly. She said, "I read in the cultural section that early humans had no medicine for hundreds of thousands of years." She paused. She said, "None." She said they had no trained doctors, no medicines, no surgical tools, just their own bodies. She said, and they survived. She said they fought things with claws, and they fell off mountains, and they were attacked by animals 10 times their size, and they bled, and they got back up. She stopped and looked at the floor. She said, "What kind of body has to be built to survive?" That the room went quiet again, and this time the quiet felt different. It did not feel like confusion anymore. It felt like the moment before you understand something that is going to change the way you see everything. Venza was the one who finally said it. She said their planet never let them be fragile. She said every other species in this coalition came from worlds that were difficult. Yes, but Earth was not just difficult, it was relentless. It was constant pressure from every direction for longer than most of our homeworlds have had complex life at all. She said, "Imagine a world where the ground shakes, the sky catches fire, the water rises and falls, and the things that want to eat you are everywhere. And you have no claws, no venom, no armor, no wings. Just a body that runs and thinks and bleeds. And the only way to survive is to make the bleeding not matter." Everyone in the room looked at the screen. On one side of the comparison chart, the Tharkai clotting speed was represented by a slow, rising line. The other side, the human line, shot up almost immediately. Else said quietly, he said, "We have been flying alongside them for 30 years. He said, "We have fought in the same battles. We have eaten in the same mess halls. We have shaken their hands and learned their words and called them our allies." He said, "And we did not know this." He said, "We never looked closely enough to see what they actually are." RS was still holding the screen with the old text about ancient warriors. He looked at it again. He said, "There is one more thing." He turned the screen so everyone could see. He pointed to the last line of the paragraph. He read it out slowly. Read it said, "In the oldest of the human languages, the word for iron and the word for blood were once the same word." The room did not make a sound. Outside the ship, the broken asteroid belt drifted in the dark, and the stars were cold and very far away, and somewhere in the medical bay, in a bed with sealed wounds and steady machines, Sergeant Dara Okonkwo was sleeping. Her body was doing what it had always done, quietly rebuilding, the way it had been built to do long before anyone in that room had ever existed. Dara woke up to the sound of soft machines. She knew that sound. She had woken up to it before more times than she liked to count. In different bays, on different ships, in different corners of space. The steady beeping that meant she was alive, and someone had decided to keep her that way. She opened her eyes. The ceiling of the medical bay was white, and smooth. The light was gentle, which told her the staff had adjusted it, knowing she would wake up sensitive from the pain medication. She noticed that detail and filed it away as something a careful doctor had done. She turned her head. There were 6 of them standing in a loose group around her bed, not hovering over her, not doing anything medical, just standing there, looking at her with an expression she had seen before, but never in this particular combination of face. Vanessa, the Tharke doctor, was there. Her dark eyes were calm, but there was something behind them that Dara recognized as the look of a person who had recently had a very large thought. Beside her was a tall Valori doctor with pale arms crossed over his chest. He was looking at her the way scientists looked at things in jars. Curious, not unkind, just intensely focused. A young Mindari nurse was standing slightly behind the others, holding a screen against his chest, like he had forgotten it was there. His mouth was slightly open. 3 other nurses stood in a small cluster, each one looking at her with the same careful, quiet attention. Dara looked at all of them, then she looked at the ceiling again. She took a breath. She said out loud, "How long was I asleep?" Vanessa stepped forward and said, 15 hours. You needed it. Your body was doing significant repair work. Dara nodded slowly. She did a quiet check of herself, the way she always did after waking in a medical bay. She felt the tight sealed pull of the wounds on her side. She moved her fingers and then her toes. She took a deeper breath and felt where the shrapnel had been. She hurt, but it was the clean kind of hurt. The kind that was healing, not the kind that was getting worse. She said, "The wounds are closing." Vensa said yes. "Faster than I expected." Dara said, "That is normal for me." Vensa said, "I know that now." Something in the doctor's voice made Dara look at her more carefully. Dara said, "You read the file." Vensa said, "I read all of it." This time, Dara was quiet for a moment. She looked around at the other faces in the room, and then she looked back at the ceiling and let out a slow breath that was not quite a sigh, but was close to one. She had had this conversation before. Not this exact conversation, but versions of it, with different species on different ships in different forms. Every time a coalition doctor or soldier or diplomat looked at her or one of her people long enough to actually see something they did not expect, it led to the same conversation, the one where she had to explain that humans were not extraordinary. They were just old. She sat up slowly. Vensa said, "You should rest." Dara said, "I have been resting for 15 hours. She swung her legs to the side of the bed and sat on the edge. She pulled up the sleeve of the medical gown and looked at a scar on her forearm from a mission 2 years ago. It was pale and smooth, now almost invisible. You would not know it had once been a cut deep enough to see bone. She said, "Do you want to ask me questions?" The young Mindari nurse with the screen said, "Yes." Came out so honestly and so fast that Dara almost smiled. She said, "All right, ask." What followed was one of the strangest conversations of her life, and she had lived a life that included strange conversations with beings from 30 different planets. They asked her about eating. She told them that humans ate iron directly from food. That meat and certain plants contained iron in a form the body could use. That her species had been managing their own iron levels through diet for as long as there had been humans to manage. Anything, the Valori doctor said, you consciously maintain a metal content in your body. Dara said yes. He said you eat specific things specifically to keep iron in your blood. She said yes, and supplements sometimes if the diet is not enough, he said. And if you do not get enough, she said, you get tired. At first, then weak, then sick. If it goes on long enough, your body starts pulling iron from storage, and eventually you cannot function properly. He said, how do you know when your levels are low? She said, you can feel it, usually fatigue first. Sometimes a craving for red meat, but is the body asking for what it needs? He said, your body tells you to eat iron. She said, yes. He said, and you just listen to it and eat more iron. She said, yes. He looked at the other doctors and nurses with an expression that had no direct translation. but meant something like, "Do you understand what I am looking at right now, Orcs?" The young nurse asked the next question, held up his screen, and said, "I found a note in the historical section about ancient warriors, about the smell." They did not know it was iron. Did they? Dara looked at the screen. She read the paragraph he was showing her. She had not seen this text before, but she knew what it was describing. She had read different versions of it in history class when she was young. The old stories, the myths, the idea that the gods marked certain people so they could not be killed. She sat with that for a moment. Then she said no. They did not know. She said they felt it though. They knew something was different about the people who kept surviving. They built stories around it, the way people do when they see something real that they cannot explain yet. She looked at her own hands. She said, "We have been explaining ourselves to ourselves for a very long time with the wrong words because we did not have the right ones yet." The room was quiet then. Venza asked the question that all the others had been waiting for. She asked Dara to tell her in her own words what she thought it meant. To be human, to carry iron, to be built the way she was built. Dara was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the wall. She looked at her hands. She looked at the sealed wounds on her side that were already knitting themselves back together beneath the bandages. She said she did not think of it as anything special. She said every species in the coalition was built by their world. She said the Tharkai had their extraordinary senses because their world required it. The Valori could hold their breath for 30 minutes because their oceans were deep and dangerous. The Mindari had 4 layers of immune response because their planet was full of things trying to infect them. She said Earth was just harder. She said the hardness went on longer. She said everything that survived on Earth survived because it refused not to, and over time that refusal became biology. It became chemistry. It became iron in the blood and fast-clotting platelets and bones that were denser than they looked, and a brain that kept running calculations about survival even during sleep. She said, "We are not special." She said we are what happens when a planet spends billions of years trying to kill everything on it, and something refuses to die. She pulled her sleeve back down. She looked at Venza directly. She said, "That is all we are, doctor, just very, very stubborn." Venza looked at her for a long time then. The doctor said something she had not planned to say, had not prepared, and would not have said to a patient under any normal circumstances. She said, I'm glad you came to us in peace." Dara looked at her, and for the first time since waking up, the soldier's composure shifted. Just slightly, just for a moment, something moved behind her eyes, something old and tired and deeply human. She said quietly, "So, are we?" The ship was quiet at the 3rd hour of the night cycle. Most of the crew was sleeping. The medical bay was dim and peaceful. The machines beside the beds beeped in slow, steady rhythms like the breathing of something very large and very calm. Venza sat at her desk. She had been sitting there for 2 hours. In front of her was her report. She needed to finish it before the morning shift. It was a standard post-battle medical report, the kind she had written hundreds of times: patient names, wound types, treatments given, recovery projections. Nothing complicated, nothing unusual, except that tonight she could not write it because every time she tried to write the line about Sergeant Daro Conco, her hand stopped. She leaned back in her chair and looked at the ceiling of her small office. She thought about the conversation in the medical bay that afternoon. She thought about Dara, sitting on the edge of the bed with her legs hanging down and her sealed wounds and her pale old scar, and her voice that was tired and honest and completely without performance. She thought about the word Dara had used: stubborn, just very, very stubborn. Venza turned that word over in her mind. She looked at it from different angles, the way she looked at a complicated diagnosis, the way she looked at something that seemed simple but kept revealing new depth the longer she stared. She thought about what stubborn really meant when you applied it to 500 million years. She thought about the first tiny organisms in the ancient oceans of Earth, clinging to their iron when everything around them was changing and dying. She thought about all the things that had come after them, everything that crawled and swam and ran and climbed, everything. That fought and bled and healed and reproduced and died and left something behind that was slightly harder to kill than what came before. She thought about it going on and on like that for longer than she could really hold in her mind, longer than her species had existed, longer than most planets in the coalition had been alive. Generation after generation of creatures that refused. Generation after generation of bodies that bled and kept going. And at the end of all of that, a woman who could sit up after 15 hours of unconsciousness and look at her wounds and say, "The healing is normal," for Mavensa got up from her desk. She walked down the corridor to the medical bay. The room was dim and warm. She walked between the beds, slowly, not wanting to wake anyone. She passed the Valori soldiers who were sleeping deeply. Their monitors showed normal. She passed the Mindari patient whose condition had improved significantly since yesterday. She stopped at the last bed. Dara was asleep, not restlessly, not fighting it, just deeply and completely asleep, the way someone slept when their body was doing serious work and had decided that nothing else was important. Right. Now Venza stood beside the bed and looked at the monitors. The readings were remarkable, not in an alarming way, in the opposite way, in the way that made Venza want to call Alsh in the middle of the night again and show him, because she needed someone else to see it and confirm. She was not projecting. The wound repair was ahead of the projected schedule by nearly 8 hours. The iron levels in the blood, which had dropped significantly during the blood loss the night before, were already climbing back toward normal. The body had begun pulling stored iron from the liver, redistributing it, regulating itself without any intervention from Venza or her team, without any medication or supplement beyond the basic treatment already given. The body was managing itself, quietly, efficiently, without being asked, like it had always known what to do, like it had always done this. Venza walked back to her office and sat down, and this time she picked up her stylus and she started to write. She wrote the standard sections first, the names, the wounds, the treatments. She wrote them quickly and accurately, the way she always did. Then she reached the section at the end of each report called Additional Medical Notes. That section was optional. Most doctors left it blank or put a single line about anything unusual in the treatment. Venza wrote for a long time. She wrote about the iron. She wrote about hemoglobin. She wrote about the evolutionary path and the great oxidation event and the organisms that had refused to let go. She wrote about clotting speed and wound recovery rates. She wrote about the comparison charts she had pulled up the night before and what the numbers actually showed when you looked at them carefully. She wrote about the ancient warriors and the smell they carried and the mythologies built around a biological fact that no one understood yet. She wrote about Dara. She wrote about the way Dara had said, because it is like it was the simplest thing in the world, like it required no more explanation than the color of the sky. She wrote about what Dara had said in the bay that afternoon, about stubborn, about refusing to die, about a planet that spent billions of years trying to end everything and the things that answered that pressure by becoming something harder, and then she stopped. She looked at what she had written. It was too long for an additional notes section. She knew that it was not appropriate for a standard medical report. She knew that too. She wrote it anyway because she was a doctor, and her job was to understand what she was treating, and she had been treating humans for 6 years without understanding what they actually were. She was not going to make that mistake again. She wrote one more paragraph at the very end. She wrote it slowly. She wrote that in her 60 years of medicine, she had treated beings from 41 different worlds. She had seen biology that astonished her. She had seen immune systems that seemed impossible. She had seen healing that seemed like a trick of the numbers, and strength that seemed beyond what evolution could explain. She wrote that she had always believed she understood the humans reasonably well. She wrote that she had been wrong. She wrote that humans were not unusual in the way that most coalition species meant when they called something unusual. They were not unusual the way a rare mineral was unusual, or the way an exotic species from a distant system was unusual. They were unusual, the way a very old thing was unusual, the way something that had survived everything was unusual. She wrote that every scar on every human body was not just a record of damage, it was a record of refusal. Every closed wound was a 500 million year answer to a question the universe kept asking. The question was, can you survive this? And the answer had always been the same. The answer was yes. She wrote that the coalition had spent 30 years treating humans like allies and never quite like what they were. She wrote that she did not know exactly what they were, but she knew they were not fragile, and she knew that the blood that smelled like metal in her hands last night was not a curiosity or an accident or a quirk of alien biology. It was inheritance. It was everything that had ever survived on a hard and beautiful and relentless planet, passed down across time, without interruption, without pause, without a single generation that gave up. She put down her stylus. She looked at the screen. Outside the window, the stars were completely still. Somewhere in the galaxy, on a planet called Earth, it was some ordinary hour of some ordinary day, and people were waking up and eating and working and bleeding. Small cuts that closed in minutes, and never thinking about why they just lived. They just kept going. The way they always had, the way they were made to. Venza saved the report. She turned off the desk light. She sat in the dark for a while. And she felt something she did not have a medical word for, something that was not quite awe and not quite gratitude and not quite the particular chill that comes from understanding something enormous for the first time. It was all of those things together. It was the feeling of realizing that the people sitting beside you at the table, the ones you had laughed with and argued with and patched up and sent back into danger, were carrying something ancient and extraordinary in their veins, and had never once mentioned it because to them it was just Tuesday. It was just the way blood worked. It was just what it meant to be alive, and that was the most human thing of all.